Thank you and welcome to everyone here today. I'm John Pryor, I'm Solutions Director at 26 and we're a digital marketing agency and Umbraco Contributing Gold Partner. We've been working with Umbraco for about 10 years. I personally do solutions architecture, process design, platform consultancy, business analysis, but I've also been front-end developer, back-end developer, project manager and various other bits over the course of the last 20 years or so. Today, I'll be talking about some of the barriers that prevent our platform choices being centered on user needs and how we can use capability frameworks to address some of those issues. What I'll be touching on is the exploding complexity of the digital technology landscape, understanding the capabilities you need to meet your users' needs, how to build that out into a framework that you can then apply to platform selection, and how to place Umbraco within that framework. So let's talk about complexity. We all know that our choices are becoming more complicated. User and business expectations are always increasing. Available channels, speed of response, self-service capabilities, levels of functionality, accessibility of information. And there's a vast, never-increasing number of platforms available to help us do that. The Martech 5000, which tracks digital experience platforms across various categories like content experience management, advertising, social management, and so on, is now tracking over 8,000 products, despite the name. And that's up from less than 1,000 only 7 years ago. The competition between all those platforms is pushing ever faster innovation, which is great for us. It gives us more tools to deliver better experiences, but it's very hard to keep up with. And harder to keep up with still, it's not just the platforms, but the segments and categories they exist in too, which are mutating and overlapping, meaning that you're not just choosing what platforms you need in your stack, but even what product categories you're going to have to select them from. These are just some of the types of systems that we might include within an overarching digital experience stack. Not all will apply to all solutions. In fact, they can't. Some of them represent competing approaches, such as the very obvious content management system versus digital experience platform argument. But then this list also doesn't really go into the detail of specific their own unique system types like hospitality and central reservation systems, property management systems, EdTech and VLEs, and so on. It's also a bit light on infrastructure type systems, but it's not here to be a comprehensive list. It's here to show the difficulty of tracking what you need in the technology stack if you take a technology-centered approach to that. When you think about it, when are you making platform selection decisions in a project? It's generally pretty early. It might even be before you've got funding approval or a delivery team selected and you know what skills you're working with. It's going to be before you've started any detailed prototyping, and it's almost certainly going to be before you really get the solutions to your user needs identified. So what do you have to go off? You can use your own existing experience, and if you're doing big design up front or heavy requirements analysis up front, that's effectively the choice you're making, whether you realize that's what you're doing or not. You can go off other teams' experiences, tales of successful projects that you've heard elsewhere, perhaps at a conference, perhaps in conversation. Both of those routes tend to limit the potential for innovation. Instead of allowing for fundamental change, they're focused towards replicating what worked before, with tweaks, with areas where you know that you can innovate and deliver towards specific needs, but fundamental change tends to be out. And sometimes that's not what you need, sometimes. Alternatively, you can go off platform vendors' previous experiences in the form of case studies, feature lists, and other sales pitch materials, which is great for them because it's based on their experience of what sells well to people like us, but it's not so obviously great for your users. So what does not picking the right platforms or using the right techniques to pick the right platforms mean? If you end up going requirements heavy at an early stage, you're probably ending up picking by feature list, maybe using a weighted scorecard. That can tend to lead you towards platforms which do a lot. They tick off a lot of boxes, but they don't necessarily do the things you'll really need really well. Alternatively, picking all best of breed tools in a composable architecture sounds great, but it can also lead you to having too many systems for your own team to be able to manage effectively, or overlapping system responsibilities. If you select platforms in isolation, one by one, how well will the integration models work? Data and functionality silos work users have to move around your platforms and interface to interface are probably going to present a pretty poor experience. If you end up missing out key functionality, then you may have to do more bespoke development, and that combined with data and functionality silos in particular leads to platform immobility, where you have too much invested in your current way of doing things to be able to see a way to move on without ripping the whole thing up. And you have to be able to have a plan to move on, because even if you don't, the world will be. So this is where I try to talk about outcomes and capabilities rather than requirements and platforms at the early stage. Requirements and platforms are the answer at the end of your process. They're specific, detailed. You arrive at them once you've decided how to build things. Outcomes are the result that you want to achieve. The solution is still to be determined. They're driven by user needs. They're closely related to the third part of the standard connect user story template. As an X, I need to Y so that I can Z. It's the Z part we're looking here, but we're orienting that towards platform choices rather than implementation. And then those outcomes together form a capability, which is a collection of functionality with the power to deliver a set of outcomes. Don't get me wrong at this point. Eventually, you need requirements, you need platform selection, but in an implementation process, you wouldn't define requirements ahead of your user research and understanding your user needs. You reach that point when you're building up your solution, iterating through and seeing what works. At the point you need to keep possibilities open, that's where you stay talking about outcomes and capabilities. This is kind of what the difference looks like. Openly framed statements rooted in user requirements but oriented towards delivery. So I can illustrate this with an example. I'm going to show you soon a general capability framework that we use. And one of the issues I struggled with when we were creating it was that I initially had a segment in it called marketing automation. And that's quite a specific platform segment. But in this framework, it was sat alongside more abstract capabilities around content personalization, user activation, so on. And those are concepts that are also very much in the toolkit of many marketing automation platforms. So why did I have marketing automation as a category of its own? And after worrying away at it for, well, let's just call it an embarrassingly long time, I realized that I was substituting marketing automation software for a set of journey personalization capabilities and outcomes that might well be a reason to select a marketing automation platform, but that's not the only way to deliver those capabilities. And that's not the only capabilities that marketing automation can deliver. So what does creating a good set of capabilities look like? User needs are the key source. That's what this is about, informing your platform choice based on your knowledge of and insight into your own users. So the key danger to avoid is sources which aren't based on user needs, like market segments or feature comparisons or previous experience. That was my mistake with marketing automation when I talked about that just now. Experience. Okay, we'll come back to experience. We don't want to throw away previous experience. We just want to make sure it's validly applied. And that does come down to the more general point next here about using open rather than closed framing. If there's only one possible way to deliver a capability you've defined, that's an indication that it's been too tightly defined using closed concepts. Cohesion is also important. If there are unrelated concepts being grouped together, that's possibly an indication that the analysis is leaning too heavily on an understanding of a particular platform, perhaps from past experience, or feature list comparisons from market analysis tools. So, for example, being able to build forms and use them to store the data submitted from them, that's a cohesive capability. Being able to build forms and use them to deliver scored leads to your sales team is not cohesive because there are a couple of different capabilities in there. And even though you might want one platform to deliver all of them, you also might not. So many standard business analysis techniques remain valid here. Mind mapping, cluster analysis, stepwise refinement, those can all help to build out and refine a framework from your original sources, so long as you can tie the results back to genuine user needs at the end of that. So I talked about using previous experience. This is an expensive process. going back to the original point about the complexity of the digital landscape, you can't review that from scratch for every project. There are valid, repeatable patterns that can be applied so that you can focus your attention on the areas where your user needs are unique or you have the opportunity for innovation within a project. And let's face it, how many projects do most of us work on where the entire experience stack is up for replacement? You might be replacing a CMS and its underlying infrastructure, maybe data management systems and some communication systems alongside it, but it would be unusual to also take on an organization's entire enterprise resource planning suite at the same time. So you need a way to be able to interrogate existing stacks and find out where new systems should fit within them. So this is a framework that we use. It's a layered model which is aimed at specifically at digital marketing and e-commerce projects and roadmaps. So let's break it down layer by layer. The management layer addresses operational processes and systems, gathering of data and how it's processed, the foundations without which the user experience has nothing to actually rest on. The focus on the operations side of the equation here is not the business operations per se, but it's how they impact on the user experience. Otherwise, the complexity here can get pretty fractal, particularly when you start looking at product and fulfillment capabilities. That's the core of any given enterprise. We're unlikely to need to consider a client's payroll existence, for example, in an e-commerce experience context, but stock keeping, order processing ERP components have a pretty obvious role to play in an e-commerce journey, and even accounting systems might impact how customers experience payments, refunds, invoicing. So this is a component we'll typically expect to focus a lot of individual attention on in any given project because it varies so much from sector to sector and company to company. Alongside operations, we'll also consider intelligence processes. Will we be creating the right user information? Will it be used to generate actionable insights throughout the course of the life of a stack? This model is a collection of interoperating components, and connecting the components is the key to successful delivery. So the orchestration layer is perhaps the layer which generates most of the opportunities to improve the user experience at the stack design level, because this is where the coordination of user journeys happens and the management of partners and internal teams that make those journeys work. So that can be in literal systems integration or task management and coordination, or it can be in the directly user-facing capabilities that you need to deliver the most relevant content or functionality or next steps to each user based on what they need, because these capabilities supply the power to match those things up. So this is where platforms like marketing automation, journey orchestration engines, content recommendation and product recommendation engines, customer data platforms and so on come into play. And by understanding what capabilities and collections of outcomes you need to meet your users' needs in these areas, you'll have a better understanding of what features you'll actually use and the level and type of platform you're going to require. The functionality layer here is where user-facing capabilities are delivered and where most implementation work happens. What do we do to attract and convert users, whatever conversion means to us in any given project, and how do we then deliver our service to them? To illustrate the difference between this and the previous layer, in our orchestration layer, we had a capability a segment called activation, which at a basic level is about processing data, events and triggers on existing users and prospects to proactively trigger them into new journeys at appropriate points. And that's an orchestration level capability because it involves marrying our data to actions needed. The attract and convert collections of capabilities here are about generating demand, communicating our service proposition, delivering the information that users need in order to make their decisions, but it's generally at the user's prompting. So a lot of what's in this layer is going to be about content, not how we create or manage content or how we decide how and when to deliver that content to the users or where we store it, but the actual content itself, words, pictures, interactive tools and functionality, the message and the service that we're providing. And then we have the endpoints where the users actually interact with the experience, where they engage with us. So the underlying layers provide the mechanisms necessary to provide the experience, but here is where the user actually gets to experience it. Some of these channels are directly managed and we can tightly control the nature of the engagement. like websites, whilst indirectly managed channels are mediated through third parties, and some elements of each experience will be uncontrolled or uncontrolled by us. So we can influence how we appear in search results for our content design and website implementation, for example, but we can't control how users experience that within the search engines. Otherwise, the SEO industry would look pretty different to the way it looks today. And dialogue channels allow the user to enter into one-to-one conversations where needed, and that's uniquely powerful, but also uniquely expensive. So that's an area to approach with caution. So this is the mile-high view of all that. There are a couple of key things to note about this model at this point. So the first is that this is an abstraction level. It sits alongside a toolkit which includes background on each component, the outcomes and capabilities that they represent, the types of platforms which can deliver those, health check questions, prompts for possible opportunities, whether those are ways to improve the user experience, to address system integration issues, from a hard-headed agency perspective, services that we might look to sell the client. And that toolkit's delivered at a non-specialist level so that a small team can perform initial reviews and road mapping and identify where they need to bring in more specific expertise to work through specialist issues and opportunities. The second aspect is that this has to keep moving. These are, on the face of it, capability segments, but the tools and patterns for delivering them shift continuously, and new technologies and engagement points come into play, and as a team or an agency, new skills and services get added. So invest in keeping up to date if it's going to stay relevant. Now, how can this actually help you to manage a platform stack? Here's a pretty simple visualization of how we might map those capability segments to responsible platforms. Mostly each component here is mapped to a single system, except for generation, where there's an overlapping responsibility between three systems or three sets of systems, and that's pretty typical for that kind of capability. But hypothetically, let's say we're planning to make some changes which are represented here. So, for example, our PIM here on the left of the screen, let's say that we've got a contract up for renewal, and on review we've determined that all we're really using this to do is manage product information, which could actually be managed directly in the website. Historically, this has had use, but now our CMS tools will help us to do this job better. So let's get rid of that platform. And we've identified some capabilities, some missing capabilities that we want to add in our roadmap, but we need to understand where the responsibilities for those will sit so we can select the right platforms. So this is how this evolves. What we knew entering this was the capabilities we were losing by replacing our PIM and where they needed to move to. We identified that our personalization capabilities we're bringing in needed us to switch from an email marketing platform to a more capable marketing automation platform, and that those capabilities also needed to bridge across to our CMS so that we have joined up journeys across our different engagement endpoints. And we've actually added a new app engagement endpoint here, and in order to deliver a consistent experience, we've moved our identification capabilities into a cloud-based single sign-on system, and we know where that sits now and where it's moved from. And as the marketplace and user needs continue to change, we can use this to make coordinated plans for our overall stack that actually allow us to do something pretty key, which is comparing unlike platforms. So this comes back to avoiding premature solutionizing through closed requirements or closed platform choices. We need to equip ourselves to choose between different stack models, different approaches. So headless CMS versus traditional CMS, SaaS, PaaS versus on-premise, content management systems versus digital experience platforms versus site builders, integrated broad spectrum platforms versus composable best of breed stacks. A lot of these choices really relate to where and how you want a particular capability to be delivered. So, for example, does the orchestration of content delivery to the user need to be delivered by the same application that's handling the orchestration of content creation and management? And if so, is that taking advantage of the full capabilities of the underlying traffic delivery infrastructure? That's kind of the crux of the headless versus traditional debate, and it's become unnecessarily religious in some areas. The right answer for any given solution is going to come down to understanding the relationship between the three capability segments that represents and how that impacts on your users' needs, both internal and external. The speed of the experience, the level of specific control over content layout and orchestration. And part of the flexibility requirement here is being able to adapt that view as the situation changes. As more processing and data caching moves from both clients and servers into edge networks, for example, at the moment, that headless and traditional separation is probably going to get really blurry over the next few years. But we need to make decisions about our approach now, as well as taking that future possibility of change into account, which is why we need frameworks that help us to understand how to adapt from our current starting point. So I last mentioned Umbraco about 20 slides back, so let's fix that. And there's a few different Umbracos we could be talking about here. Classic Umbraco, Cloud, Hardcore, Uno, and they all have slightly different capability sets. I'll emphasize slightly. So let's just remind ourselves of the high-level framework view that we've been working with. It's the same as before, only this time it's blue for reasons. So Umbraco as a platform by itself has capabilities in these core glowing areas. These are really our fundamental core CMS capabilities, which we'd expect out of most CMSs. It doesn't cover everything in our digital experience stack, but no single platform will or should really. What this shows us is where there are capabilities we might need to look elsewhere for. And Umbraco gives us strong tools for working with those external capabilities. That's one of the brilliant things about Umbraco. As to the different parts of the Umbraco family, well, this also helps to show how close they are. Cloud basically adds traffic and security management capabilities. So if your preferred outcomes include minimizing the management overhead of infrastructure and application management, that's a core reason to select Cloud over on-premise. And Hardcore, well, obviously that takes away the content delivery management segment, because that's going to sit within your site generator. You might bring in other external capabilities like search and navigation or other content mesh or functionality mesh components, but you don't necessarily need to. It depends on what we come back to as our needed outcomes. Uno is an interesting one because it's not so much entire capabilities. It drops or adds in its tighter focus on the site builder model, more implementation flexibility across several capabilities. And that brings me back to a key point, which is to say an expression of a capability isn't a single word or a phrase, it's a collection of outcomes. This is an abstracted view, remember. So the detail of those outcomes is important, and you do need to return to that detail. If the generation capability within a given project needs to include outcomes around rapid delivery of campaign microsites, for example, that's the kind of outcome which would lead us towards Uno as a valid choice for selection. Outcomes which point to greater implementation complexity or bespoke delivery, that's obviously going to point us back to Cloud and Classic. And let's talk about DXPs for a second. This is obviously quite topical, and I may have revised this slide slightly since yesterday's sessions. Ultimately, this comes back to looking at unlike platforms. A DXP will have a broader set of capabilities than a CMS. That's just in the core definition. Not all of those capabilities might be in the base price of a given proposal, but they're going to be available and they're going to be part of the comparison process. But if you're evaluating or pitching Umbraco CMS against a enterprise DXP, you don't have to look at it through that lens. Look at it through the capabilities that project actually needs, that the client or team will actually have the resources to use that actually map back to real user needs. Something you might come up against is project sponsors attempting to future-proof by hoarding potential capabilities on the basis that they might need them in 3 to 5 years' time, because they can't imagine how to evolve platforms beyond that point without massive pain, effectively starting over. Well, those capabilities, those platforms, those user needs are probably going to be different at that point anyway. Evolution needs to be part of the model. So what remains is, of the remaining capabilities that need to be filled, really a guide to the platforms you might look at then to build an Umbraco-based stack that will put it on a level playing field for evaluation, which might use the Umbraco DXP framework, of course, but it doesn't necessarily have to. It's whatever plays to your strengths and the needs of the users in the project. So, wrapping up, there's too much complexity to keep track of everything that's out there. You need a way to be able to interrogate the possibilities on your own terms. You're probably going to need multiple platforms in any given scenario, except when the user needs are very simple. A single platform is probably not going to deliver all the user needs that you need to consider. Particularly, you need to be aware when you're actually making a choice and make those choices actively. Passive choices, where you're not even aware you're making a choice, increase the likelihood that you're closing down opportunities to deliver better. And, you know, that's where getting wrapped up in past experience can make you close down choices that should be available to you. Ultimately, the choices need to be based on user needs. Both present needs and future needs. The tricky thing about future user needs are they're not just the ones that you think you know about, and even the ones that you think you know about are probably going to change by the time you arrive at addressing them. So you need an adaptable framework that helps you to understand where you need to change and evolve your stack as the landscape evolves, as the user needs evolve, and as your offering evolves. And understanding Umbraco's fit within your framework will help you to evaluate it or pitch it against different platforms and different types of platforms, so you can focus on its strengths and your strengths, and rather than focusing on the competition strengths. And that's it from me. Thank you all for your attention. It's been really great to have the opportunity to speak to you here today, and I hope you've enjoyed the session and look forward to joining you later at the conference. Thanks very much.